Well, I think there's a lot of questions there. I think I think about philosophy itself in a rather old-fashioned way, I suppose. I don't think of philosophy as the science, the science of the human mind, on a par with other sciences. I think of philosophy as the human practice of reflecting on more or less everything else that we do. I think in particular of philosophy as the attempt of human beings to figure out what sorts of principles and norms should govern all their more concrete practices on the basis of their own reason, rather than on apparent external authorities. And I think in certain ways this has been the conception of philosophy from the outset. It's certainly the conception of philosophy in the Enlightenment of the 18th century, the period in which somehow I find my own intellectual home. And I think that is as relevant to today's world as it has ever been. Of course, particular problems of human beings change as their historical and social circumstances change, and certain philosophers like Richard Rorty like to emphasize that a great deal. But I myself think there are certain fundamental issues that human beings face about their relationship with themselves, with each other, and with the physical world that don't change that much, even though many of the details change. And philosophy really is focused on those issues, and I think there are certain perpetual questions that human beings face, and philosophy is our way of trying to cope with such questions. And for that, I mean, there are particular facts about today's world, that there are so many people, that we have such a tremendous variety of media, that we are being bombarded with information or pseudo-information at every moment of our waking lives, that differ certainly from previous periods. Even when you think about the philosophers of the 19th century, you think, oh, these guys worked in a world without television and without radio and without computers and without the internet. And so their ways of gathering information were different than ours. Their distractions were different than ours. No doubt they found some distractions. But we have to cope with our situation in that regard. Well, to me, that seems to make what sounds like the old-fashioned discipline of philosophy even more important than ever, because we have to figure out ways to achieve clarity in our own thought in the face of the sort of constant distractions and constant bombardment of information or pseudo-information that the contemporary world offers us. To me, that makes the classics of philosophy of enduring relevance. Perhaps not every one of equally enduring relevance, but I think that most of the philosophers who have earned the name of classic, Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus, some Stoics perhaps. Medieval philosophy for me is more of a problem because I find it closely bound up with religion, so I worked on that, especially most of the great philosophers of the modern period, Hume, Locke, Kant, Hobbes, Hegel, go on from there. Most of them, it seemed to me, have insights of value to offer us. And I think we should continue to read them. They incorporate hundreds and thousands of years of human experience in their own reflection, and there's no reason why we shouldn't stand on their shoulders, learn the practice of reflection from them, and then take it further, clarify it further, apply it, see how it applies to our circumstances, and so on. But I think there would be very little to be gained and a great deal to be lost by simply jettisoning it in the way that natural science mostly jettisons its own history. Natural science can leave history behind it. In a university, typically, the history of natural science is studied in a separate department and a separate building from where natural science is actually practiced. I don't think there's any reason we should do that in philosophy, and I think there are reasons we should not do that in philosophy. We have only to benefit from remaining engaged with our history. As to the question of whether one should have a single master from the history of philosophy, I think the answer to that is no. I mean, I think that, well, as I've said, I find a certain idea in Kant profoundly attractive, and I find Kant's way of thinking about human values more persuasive than many other ways. So I certainly want to spend a lot of my energy on Kant. But I also hinted that, for example, John Stuart Mill, even though he comes from a different tradition, has views about human freedom that are not unrelated to Kant's, and that it's worth thinking about him too, precisely because he comes to a similar conclusion from different premises. So I think that no matter how intensely interested one is in a particular philosopher, even one of the greatest, or even if one thinks the greatest, nevertheless, there's always insight to be gained by thinking about him in relation to other philosophers, thinking about how other philosophers, perhaps from similar premises, came to a different conclusion, and then we have to closely examine the arguments, or how different philosophers, starting from different premises, came to a similar conclusion, and then we also have to think about, well, does the conclusion really depend upon the arguments, or are there other arguments for it? So I think one has to think about the history of philosophy broadly and study whichever figure one is most interested in a broader context. Well, the story that I have often told is that during high school, I don't know, 10th grade or 11th grade in the American system, maybe I was 15 or 16, our assignment was to find a book of essays and write a review of a book of essays to do the literary format of a book review. And I was in the bookstall in Penn Station in New York City, not far from my home, and I came across a book entitled Enquiries Concerning Human Knowledge by David Hume, Esquire. And I started to look at it, and I thought, enquiries, that sounded like essays. And I began to read this book on the train back to my house. And I discovered that this philosopher was raising questions about the reality of causation. And I thought, this is crazy. Of course there's such a thing as cause and effect. The train wouldn't be moving unless the electricity was going through the wires and so forth and so on. But his arguments seemed very good. So I guess I began to wonder, well, we have to look at these arguments closely. They seem persuasive, but there must be something strange about them. And I came then to the class when the time came and gave the report, and all my fellow classmates looked at me like I was crazy, and the teacher looked at me like I was crazy. But I thought this was very interesting, and it really captured my imagination. And then subsequently, I simplify a little bit because I read other people along the way, but subsequently I discovered that there was this other philosopher called Kant who had tried to answer Hume's worries. And that seemed really interesting too. And then eventually I became interested in Kant, studied Kant in my first years at the university, and then, of course, gradually discovered that Kant had things to say not only about causation, but about human freedom, about the possibility of human freedom, about the value of human freedom, and then those things really caught my attention and sort of have kept me busy ever since.